Hey there, we're going to talk about checking out crankshafts and how to do it, why you should, and how to do it cheaply. So why you should is because just because you had a good running engine and we're wanting to change a piston or something simple doesn't mean that you don't have disaster just around the corner. So some really quick, like simple sanity checks you can do is just pull up and down on your rod while it's in the bike or the engine, or if it's out, whatever. And you're checking for play there, and you shouldn't feel anything, any movement whatsoever. Odds are you're going to find it with top dead center or bottom dead center more than other places, just because that's actually a really high load spot when the piston is changing direction. So you're at, say, the bottom of your power stroke, and then the piston has to go from being pushed down to going back up at whatever, 5,000, 10,000, however many thousand RPM. And that's a huge transient load versus at 90 degrees when you're right in the middle of your power stroke. That's a very smooth, push from your combustion. But do yourself a favor, check it really in all positions. Roll it around, check it for that. Rock it side to side, like this way, and odds are you'll be able to find a spec for that. Even like for this crank, it's actually 3 millimeters. I can just check that with a ruler, no big deal. You're probably gonna feel a little bit of movement on a lot of engines, and that's why they're spec. 3 millimeters is pretty wide, so you're gonna feel that, and it's fairly easy to check it. The other thing with feeler gauges is you can check your end play for the rod moving back and forth on this pin. We certainly don't want that squeezed for some reason. Maybe something got galled up, like these thrust washers or whatever got hot and they started to transfer metal and stuff gets tight. If it gets tight in there, next thing you know, your rod's tight and it's rubbing. If it's rubbing, it gets more heat and that can cause failure. So lastly, if it's still in the bike, just roll the whole assembly around, make sure it feels smooth. If and when you get it out of the engine, and you've checked everything else already and it all looks good, you really should check your basic true to make sure that your crankshafts on the outer sides here aren't going around like a jump rope, because these cranks can get squeezed. If somebody doesn't assemble the engine correctly, they can get squeezed and get knocked out of true. Maybe it was never in true. Or something else happened, like it rolled off the bench because you made a mistake, or somebody else knocked it off the bench and they didn't tell you, or maybe you pounded the thing out of the engine with a hammer because you didn't have a case splitter. Who knows, right? Stuff happens. But the important thing is you don't put it back in an engine if it's not true, because you're just asking for vibration and troubles, and you're going to eat bearings, and that's a lot more expensive than going and grabbing yourself some cheap gauges or indicators and just checking the thing. So, like I said before, we want to look to see if the outer parts of the crank are going around like a jump rope. They should be completely true. Look for a good flat spot. Try to avoid these tapered areas, because that's really hard to get a good clean reading off that. You want to have a flat area. Look for seal damage that's created pitting or anything like that, or rust that's going to give you a weird reading. So you want a good, clean, smooth, flat area, and set it up on some V blocks. So I know this setup might not look like a professional shop setup. Well, it's not, and that's the whole point here, is you don't have to have some huge jig bolted to the earth, that's like damped from seismic vibrations to get a good reading. I don't need a Starrett gauge. All those things are great, but you can just go down to your local Harbor Freight or whatever, pick this stuff up and check it out yourself. The biggest thing is get your gauge, your dial indicator zeroed in, push around on your crank and stuff, move it around and check it for true. Push on your straps a few times, see if it's moved. If it hasn't moved, you've got a good stable setup. Great. Move on to the next step, which is rolling it around just by hand and looking at it to see movement. So this crank has this keyway here, so we're gonna avoid that. But I want to be far out from the weight. The further out I am, the more exaggerated the movement will be. So we want to get as far out as we can. So I'm going to go ahead and roll this around. You can see some movement, and that's okay. If you check your specs, for this crank, 3 thousandths is okay, or 2.5 or 3 thousandths, I forget. But the point is, we have under 1,000th of movement. And you know, this, again, this is a Chinese gauge, so some people are going to say, "Oh, that gauge doesn't have the smoothest action." Well, maybe not, but the point is, it comes back to true, right? It comes back to 0, and it's showing about 1,000th out around, which is well within spec, right? So we're well within what the book asked for on this crank, and we can move on to the other side, check that. If that's good, throw it on the bike, you're good to go. If the thing spins around and it's 4 thousandths or 5 or who knows, we know we've got problems and it needs to be adjusted. So adjusting the crank is a whole separate ball of wax. I may make a video on that, but the point is that can be done at home too. And all you really need is like a copper hammer or an aluminum hammer. You can make one if you can't find one, whatever. And something that won't, you don't want to use steel. And you're basically whacking this thing with a hammer. You can hold it in your hand and hit it with a hammer and true this up. So it's more about the skill of doing it than it is about the cost. And if you check it out and it's out of true and you don't want to mess with it, just take it to a shop. There's plenty of old dirt bike guys around or snowmobile guys that are running shops, machine shop people will usually true cranks like this for you. If the crank doesn't need to be rebuilt, they'll true it up for you. Where you get into having, people tell you they won't do the work is if the crank needs to be rebuilt. Some shops don't want to take a crank apart and press it apart. Sometimes the parts to rebuild the crank aren't available, depending on what it is. So anyway, that's the basics of inspecting a crankshaft. And don't be afraid of it. Always check it. Don't assume. Give yourself a good chance at having a good running engine.